Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Joined for the first time, I have to concede, by a former Vice President of the United States of America, Al Gore. Many thanks for joining us this morning, and welcome. You are also, of course, and perhaps more pertinently these days, a climate change campaigner. You've just released your second film. It's imminent release in Britain. It's been released in America, an Inconvenient sequel, 10 years after An Inconvenient Truth, which was designed to wake the world up to the danger that it faced. Let's begin at the very beginning. I saw the latest film last night, and it left me equally dismayed and hopeful, actually. I don't know if that was the intention. It was a curious mixture of optimism and pessimism, but I hadn't realised that your interest in the field dated back 40 years. I mean, pretty much to almost before I was born. You were quite ahead of the curve on that. What first excited your interest in an issue that didn't get any coverage at all back then?
Well, I was fortunate back in the 1960s as a college student to learn from a great professor who was one of the greatest climate scientists in history. Roger Revelle was the first person to measure CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. And that's what ignited my interest in this. I never imagined that it would take over my life the way it has. But 7 years after I graduated from college, I was elected to the Congress and asked what's being done, and nothing was being done. So I organized the first congressional hearing in the U.S. and invited my professor to come and be the lead witness. And when it did not create the epiphany for my colleagues in a 20-minute statement that he had created for me in a full course, that's when I first asked myself the question, how can this be communicated in a way that's understandable? And that led me on the journey that I'm continuing.
You expected an epiphany?
Naively, yes, because I was quite young then, in my 20s, and I had the aha moment learning from him. And I really did expect that when we had this hearing, it would result in people saying, really, are you serious that it's happening this way? But it didn't have that effect. And of course, that was one of the first times I encountered the anti-climate movement from the polluters pushing back against it.
And it hasn't gone away, because 30 years later you were in a congressional or a Senate committee hearing, a senator, I think, and he was told off by the chairwoman of the committee for trying to sort of badger you, and you sort of went a little bit emotional. Quite an odd thing to see in the context of a political interrogation, where you said, I wish I could talk to you privately. I wish I could somehow communicate. There was a frustration there that was very, very human. This guy was clearly on pursuing an agenda, but you you clearly still feel that if you could just find that key, you could unlock the most virulent of deniers.
Yes, and over time I've learned to recognize those who are reading from an internal teleprompter and aren't really open to persuasion at all, but many are open. And actually quite a few former climate deniers have changed sides and are now recognizing how serious this is. Mother Nature has a powerful voice, and these climate-related extreme weather events are really waking a lot more people up all over the world. These events have become a lot more common and a lot more destructive.
It's one of the most compelling elements of the film, the international evidence, the filmed evidence that doesn't perhaps get the news coverage that one might expect, everywhere from Florida to the Philippines, the flooding. But of course, as you know, climate deniers routinely claim that your citing of these floods is no more evidence of global warming than you know, a cold snap is evidence that there's no such thing.
Yes, and so when you turn to the scientific community, including the Royal Academy of Science here in the United Kingdom, they're virtually unanimous and have been for a long time. And actually, the hottest year ever measured globally was last year. The second hottest was the year before, the third hottest the year before that. 16 of the 17 hottest have been in the last 17 years. So the pattern is increasingly difficult to deny. And now the consequences with these rain bombs. There was another one in the UK yesterday.
As I was making my way to the cinema to see your film, actually. My shoes are still wet.
One of the scenes is in Miami, Florida, yes, where on a sunny day they have flooding now at high tide because the sea level has increased so much. But I was back in Miami a week ago yesterday, and a week ago Tuesday, the journalists in Miami were invited to see the film. While they were in the theater, one of these rain bombs hit Miami, 7 inches of rain in 2 hours, and when they came out of the theater, the streets were all flooded. And I'm not laughing about that.
No,
I'm just at the irony. Both Miami and New Orleans were flooded last week by these so-called rain bombs. And what's causing it, of course, is 90% of the extra heat trapped by the global warming pollution goes into the oceans, and they evaporate a lot more water vapor into the sky, which feeds these unprecedented downpours of the kind the UK has been having the last few years.
And yet the governor of Florida, or a recent governor of Florida, would be one of the people to deny the evidence of his own eyes on the streets of his own constituency. How do you just touched on something a moment ago, how do you tell the difference between somebody who doesn't get it but is open to persuasion and somebody who does get it but pretends not to?
Well, experience helps you spot the difference. The conservative Republican mayor of that city of Miami has now changed. Several of the Republican congressmen from South Florida have joined what they're calling the Noah's Ark caucus in the Congress. Not only a reference to the biblical deluge, but they joined by twos, one Republican and one Democrat together. And so there is now a steady stream of people switching their opinions and saying, yes, look, this is not political, should never have been. We're all in this together. Let's solve it.
It's quite a human reaction. You need to feel the water at your ankles. You need to see the evidence of your own eyes. So simultaneously it makes your job perhaps easier, but also provides proof that you haven't been successful enough in the past.
Well, that's true. And another example, a Republican community in Kansas was destroyed by an F5 tornado, the worst kind. And when they made the decision to build the town back, they said, look, let's go to 100% renewable energy. And the movie tells the story of Georgetown, Texas.
He's quite a character, isn't he?
Oh, a wonderful character. Conservative Republican Trump supporter in the heart of oil country. But he's an accountant by trade, and he did the arithmetic and decided to switch the entire city to 100% solar and wind. Their electricity bills have gone way down, the air is cleaner, and it's kind of a side benefit that they're helping to save the future of humanity.
So he's done it with a hard-headed pragmatism rather than any sort of environmental idealism.
Yes, and more are. I mean, ultimately it requires both. A change in thinking to realize how serious this is and what our obligations to solve it are, but also it's helped enormously by the fact that these new technologies like solar and wind, electric cars, batteries, sustainable efficiency improvements are coming down so quickly in cost that it's a sensible economic decision to switch also.
And yet, of course, the economics of resisting or denying or skepticism is huge. And the thing that occurred to me watching the film last night was the tobacco industry, and you look back on that and you almost can't quite believe the effort that was put into punting something that was demonstrably untrue. Yeah,
the doctors found the evidence with the scientists that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer and a lot of other diseases, and the tobacco companies decided to spend a lot of money. They, among other things, they hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and put them in front of cameras to falsely reassure people that there was no medical evidence of harm. And 100 million people died unnecessarily. It's been well documented that the large carbon polluters, not all of them, but enough of them, have actually used that same playbook, hired the same PR consultants, and are doing exactly the same thing to try to fool people into ignoring what the truth is. The truth is inconvenient for them, and so they try to pull the wool over other people's eyes so they can squeeze out profits for more decades while the future is threatened for everyone else.
But because the profits are so immense.
Yes.
And so sort of mind-bogglingly.
Yes, but, years ago, one of the oil ministers in Saudi Arabia said the Stone Age didn't end because of a shortage of stones. It ended because something better came along. And the age of petroleum and fossil fuels is beginning to end because something better is coming along. We get on the Earth more energy from the sun in 1 hour than all of the energy used by the global economy for a full year. So as they learn how to harvest a higher fraction of that enormous amount of energy profitably, it's inevitable that we're going to switch to renewable sources.
And it's not just, one of the most interesting elements was when you spoke to the head of Solar City, the tech company that has pioneered cheaper and much more effective solar panels. And you tasked yourself with persuading him to give his technology for free to India, so that India would drop their plans to build 300 coal-fired power stations and instead go down, because it's a powerful argument, isn't it, that the Indian politician made. You guys have had 150 years.
Absolutely.
You created your civilization on the back of fossil fuels. You can't really turn around and tell me that I've got to clean up your mess and deny my population. So you gave them something better. But that was almost an assault upon capitalism when you tried to persuade that Silicon Valley entrepreneur to give away, in a way, future earnings.
Well, capitalism can't succeed if we don't have an earth on which to practice capitalism.
I think that's an uncontroversial observation.
Yeah. And you can easily understand what some of the leaders of these poor developing countries are saying. But you can also see that their people have trouble breathing with all of the air pollution that the coal burning is causing. There was a political crisis in China because of the air pollution, and that's one of the reasons why China began to switch. India's done an amazing U-turn since the Paris Agreement. They just announced that within only 13 years, 100% of their cars and trucks that are new will have to be electric vehicles. That's faster than the UK or France and certainly the US. So they're now responding to the demands of their own people to clean up the pollution.
If this was the BBC, I'd now have to find somebody to contribute to the conversation from the other side of the coin.
It's shocking how the BBC has engaged in climate denial, isn't it? I did an interview.
Say that, would you?
Pardon me?
You'd say that they.
Well, I had a personal experience with it this morning. It's really shocking.
Because they would now bring on, I don't know, Nigel Lawson or somebody with no scientific training whatsoever. Although you're no scientist yourself, your contention is that because we have a false equivalence, you're describing how bad tobacco is, to use your historical analogy. Now you bring on someone dressed as a doctor to tell you that it's not. Do you see it that starkly?
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely clear. Absolutely.
The science isn't unanimous, and the figures are usually in the mid to mid 90s, aren't they? Usually we read about
it's
95.
Between 97 and 99%. Yeah.
And where does the 1 to 3% come from? The scientists who say that you're wrong.
Well, that's a de minimis number, and
yes.
You're always going to have something like that. If you had chest pains and they increased, and you were somehow able to consult with the 100 leading heart specialists in the world, and 97 of them said, oh my gosh, you need to take this medicine, you need to change your diet, you need to make these other changes, would you wait to find 2 or 3 who said, no, everything's fine, you don't have to worry about it? Well, maybe some would.
Yes, probably more than 10 years ago.
But most would not.
We live in strange times with regard to truth. On both sides of the Atlantic, it's become particularly acute in recent years. How do you, as a career politician up until embarking full-time on this mission, how do you explain the alacrity with which people can be persuaded to vote against their own interests? Because climate change is possibly the beginning and the biggest example of that growing trend.
Yes. Well, those with accumulated wealth and legacy political power have in every age made efforts to protect the privileges that have led to the accumulation of that wealth, even when changes for the benefit of the many are obviously necessary. I think when the introduction of television as the dominant medium put gatekeepers who controlled access to the public sphere. I think that, in my country at least, was the time when candidates for office and politicians began to focus the majority of their time on begging special interests for enough money to buy the TV ads. But now I think you're seeing with the social media and internet-based media a challenge to the dominance of television. And I think it's opening up new avenues to use the best available evidence and reason once again as a source of political power. In my country last year, the Bernie Sanders campaign, whether you agree with his agenda or not, proved that
Do you agree with his agenda?
Some things, not all. But the point I'm making is that the way he raised his financing was revolutionary. He showed it's now possible to not accept any money from special interests and lobbyists, but instead to go out and base your campaign on very small donations from individuals over the internet. I'm hoping that's the future of politics, so that those elected will be more accountable to the people they're supposed to represent and less beholden to and accountable to the big wealthy special interests that try to tell them what their agenda should be once they're in office.
These politicians are supposed to be employees, aren't they?
Yes, they're supposed to serve the people, and often they serve their big donors instead. 100 years ago in my country, a famous journalist named Upton Sinclair wrote, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something if his income depends upon him not understanding it."
Gosh.
And if you substitute campaign contributions and lobbyist gifts for income, then that's the reason why some of the elected officials just find it difficult to understand that the point of view of their big donors is not actually truthful.
If there is, and I should choose my words carefully, Mr. Vice President, the latest film had more of an eye upon posterity, perhaps, than the first film. It was both a mission statement and a powerful piece of campaigning, but also it was a testimony to Al Gore's work in this field, of which you should be rightly proud. But is that a fair observation?
Well, it had a different set of directors. Bonnie Cohen and John Schenck have the so-called cinema verite approach. I had to Google that to figure out what it meant. And what it meant was that they followed me around with cameras for 2 years. The director of the first film, Davis Guggenheim, did a wonderful job, won an Oscar for actually portraying more of a sequential, fact-based presentation, which I loved. This is a different film.
Yes.
It's a more emotional film. People get very engaged in it. They come away feeling hopeful, but with an increased sense of urgency. And I think Bonnie and John have done a fabulous job.
Tell me a little about the training that you sponsor internationally. I didn't know much about that. The idea, I mean, I also have to at this point, this isn't false equivalence. This is what the climate change deniers would describe as the brainwashing of our young children, isn't it?
Well, I have a series of trainings all the time where people come for 3 days and learn about the facts of the climate crisis. I bring scientists along to get into the technical details, and we have experts in communication and persuasion to help them with the skills they need to go out and spread the word. It's based on a theory that because the special interests have so much control at the top, what's really needed is a grassroots movement to bring about enough political change to overturn the dominance of these special interests.
And I suppose you mentioned it was a 2-year process, the film. In an ideal world, it would have ended with the signing of the Paris Agreement. That would have been
yes,
the
but we anticipated in the making of the film that we'd have to wait to see who won the election and then to see what he or she did and how we felt about it. And of course, Donald Trump made a speech June 1st withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. But, couple of points. The U.S. cannot legally leave until the day after the next presidential election in 2020. But more importantly, the day after Trump made that speech, the entire rest of the world redoubled its commitment to the agreement. And in the U.S., our large states like California and New York and many others, and hundreds of cities and business leaders said, no, we're still in the Paris Agreement, and we're going to meet the commitments the U.S. made, regardless of what Donald Trump says or tweets.
It's an example of how surreal things have become politically. No, I mean, the president says one thing, governors queue up to say the opposite. America leads the world on an issue like this, and then in the blink of an eye, America is the only country on the planet that's resisting it.
Well, there's a distinction now between Donald Trump on the one hand and the United States of America on the other. On this issue, he does not speak for the United States of America. Also, there's a law of physics that says for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. The reaction to Donald Trump has been incredibly powerful. We now have the biggest surge in grassroots activism ever in reaction to the absurdities and excesses of the Trump presidency.
Is he an example of fossil fuel money, of the sort of petrochemical industry money influencing politics?
Yes, he's thrown his lot in with these climate deniers, and he's appointed a rogues gallery of deniers who have gained control of his positions and thinking on this issue.
What I'm sort of looking at the Paris Agreement and looking at the implications more widely of Donald Trump's denial or skepticism or what you want to call it. Who benefits? I mean, do you think he is going to reopen coal mines? Do you think he is actually going to make life easier for the oil barons?
Oh, yes, he's trying to. But the jobs in the coal industry were really eliminated by the coal companies themselves as they automated. And then cheaper natural gas became available through this awful fracking process. That's really what cost the jobs in the coal industry. You know, there's a famous coal museum in the state of Kentucky in the heart of coal country, and it just switched to solar energy because it's cheaper and it meets their budget. And I think it's a symbol of the fact that the age of coal is now over. Not entirely, but it's ending. The market capitalization of the coal companies has fallen almost 90% in the last decade. And whatever Trump tries to do is going to fly in the face of these enormous economic trends away from coal.
So, for the long-term future of Earth, are you more optimistic now than you were 10 years ago?
Yes. Yes, I am.
The election of Donald Trump notwithstanding? Notwithstanding
the election of Donald Trump, because it's almost miraculous that the cost of these alternatives has come down so incredibly fast and continues to go down. There have been 3 new contracts signed around the world in the last couple of months for unsubsidized electricity from solar at less than half the cost of electricity from burning coal. Here in the UK, you get more electricity from wind than from coal now, and there was one day earlier this year where for the first time in a century and a half, the United Kingdom did not burn any coal for electricity. And this is in keeping with the trend that's taking hold all over the world.
And Scotland had a day when it was entirely wind-powered, I think, or certainly entirely renewable.
Yes, several of them, and for the entire month of June.
We've nearly reached the end of our time, and I haven't mentioned Russia or North Korea, for which I think I deserve a small pat on the back. I'm not going to let you go without asking your thoughts on at least one of them, but I'll do it in a slightly strange way. I wonder if you could tell my listeners what happened when a former congressman called Tom Downey, who was working on your campaign in 2000, was he took delivery unexpectedly of some information that was detrimental to George Bush, your rival, and potentially helpful to you. And obviously this has parallels with Donald Trump Jr. being approached by people telling him they've got information that could be damaging to Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, he received a document that was stolen from the Bush campaign, and he consulted with us and immediately turned it over to the FBI. And then he immediately recused himself from any further participation in the debate preparation. It was Bush's debate prep book. I never saw it because he sealed it back up immediately and gave it to the FBI.
And no longer played your sparring partner. Correct. Just in case of any even perception or suspicion of wrongdoing.
It was the ethical thing to do.
Well, then I must ask you what you feel ethically about an invitation to Donald Trump Jr. to meet with someone promising damaging information about Hillary Clinton that he accepted with alacrity.
Doesn't look good, does it? I have no inside information about the facts. I take great comfort from the fact that the U.S. now has a special investigator in charge of this who is respected across the board, a man of unquestioned integrity. If he finds that no wrongdoing took place, then I will accept his findings. If he finds there were serious violations of law, then that could be big trouble for Donald Trump. And the next few months could be challenging for the United States.
And finally, is what you know of the machine in the current White House powerful enough to put the brakes on any presidential ambitions to engage with North Korea?
The North Korea crisis has been building for a long time, and in fairness to Donald Trump, it should be said that he inherited this. The last several administrations have not been able to resolve this crisis.
And the UN sanctions last week, that was a diplomatic triumph for him as well.
It was a triumph, and President Trump deserves credit for that, absolutely. And I hope that China, having voted for the Security Council resolution, will now enforce those sanctions. It is a bright light in an otherwise bleak situation. Now, I think that President Trump's rather intemperate statements of 2 days ago did not help matters. But again, he has a defense secretary and a national security advisor who are immensely respected. They have cooler heads, and I hope he listens to them.
Al Gore, many thanks indeed.
Thank you, James.
No, thank you. It's 11:31, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That was an excellent and informative interview with Al Gore. Thank you. Now let's hear from some tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. That's not very kind, Incorrigible FCA, although I do find myself increasingly puzzled. I've told you quite a few times in the past, and it actually happened. I hadn't realised. I'll probably get stuck in a lift with someone who was responsible for the booking next time I'm at the BBC. I hadn't realised that Nigel Lawson had actually been on a programme that Al Gore appeared on earlier as the kind of balancing voice. And it just confuses me that the science can be so irresistible, really, in any sort of objective sense, and yet nice people, not just the ones who get to make lots of money out of this, but nice people can be so satisfactorily and so successfully persuaded that it's not true. I think probably we'll look at that. Do you think, let's use the tobacco analogy, do you think that climate change deserves to be described in the same way as tobacco, given that it became clear decades ago that tobacco was killing people, and yet the industry invested epic amounts of money and effort in promulgating the opposite position? It caused, as Al Gore just told us, millions of deaths, and he was right. These are historical truths. Actors dressed up as doctors would appear on television and not just tell you that smoking wasn't bad for you, but tell you that smoking was actively good for you. I didn't really. It is, as David says, interesting how many ex-politicians become so much more open and compelling when they've actually stepped away from frontline politics. But there is a reason for that. It's to do with accountability and electability. But I like that tobacco analogy, and I know that it will be offensive is not quite the right word, but challenging to a lot of people who are on the other side of the argument. I never really picked a horse in this race until I started reading up on it. And again, it was one of those issues where I found my position being informed more by the side that I didn't end up supporting than the side that I did. It's like so many other areas of public discussion in Britain at the moment, where all of the expert opinion lines up on one side, and then on the other side you have billionaire-backed skepticism or billionaire-backed denialism. And I don't know how you address that conundrum without either, I don't know, patronising the ordinary punter, sort of calling them stupid, or what? I don't know. Moving along and pretending that it is an equal and balanced argument. 11:38 is the time. Just give us a call, okay? And have a look at that tobacco analogy. Because that, I mean, if that was, it's like he said when he first started out, he thought there'd be a key, a moment of epiphany. You'd explain something to people. Everything's getting hotter. Everything is getting hotter. That is why more water is evaporating into the sky. That is why the kind of storms and floods that we're seeing all over the world are growing in incidence. Pollution, breathing, all of these things, to me, are kind of self-evident, even though I don't want them to be true. It's so emblematic of modern politics. The things you don't want to be true, the evidence tells you they are, and yet people on the other side of the argument insist that the evidence is wrong and that experts or knowledge or science can't be trusted. Sounding reasonable on that, with just that suggestion that climate change sort of sums everything up at the moment. And then, of course, the Donald Trump angle doubles down on that view. The idea that an almost a proud ignorance. I don't know. I know what I know, and I like what I like. I don't care what the experts say. I don't care what the scientists say. The Paris Agreement in that film that I watched last night, I hadn't realised. Oh, blast! There was one question I forgot to ask him. It was the only one I came out of the cinema thinking I must ask him about that. I'll tell you what it was in a minute. But the Paris Agreement was like a denouement to pretty much every country on the planet agreeing to move in the same direction on an issue that will affect the health of our children. And there's a part of me, even at the age of 45, that doesn't quite understand the resistance to that. The argument that, no, don't listen to them, ignore them. Because ... you are going to have to pay more taxes. You are going to have to. So what I'm saying is, I don't want to fall out, and I am pretty much persuaded by the science, what I understand of it, and by the advocacy of people like Al Gore. But I do want to, as ever, in my silly little way, I do kind of want to understand the position on the other side of the fence. He was really cross, I can tell you now, about that. Well, he accused the BBC of being climate change deniers, which is probably the polar opposite of what most climate change deniers think the BBC represents. Which kind of, again, sums up everything in a way. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. What do you think of what you just heard? And what do you think will change minds in the coming years, in either direction? Obviously, I subscribe to the school of thought that says the minds will change in the direction of evidence and knowledge and expertise, but maybe minds will change in the other direction. I don't know. I just want to hear as many different voices and as many different positions on this one that I can. And then, of course, at 12 o'clock, everything changes, and we'll kick on with Mystery House. There's a couple of phone lines free. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I've got this sense of There's a really killer question that I want to ask you, and I haven't quite managed to find out what it is. And I don't want this to be a kind of, a binary slanging match. I want it to be an examination of what is probably the most important issue on the planet. And that's another example of climate change summing up everything, because German voters were polled recently on what they thought the most important issues facing their country was. And they answered climate change, as in the most important issue facing the planet is the most important issue facing our country. And the world divides, doesn't it now, along one line. On one side of the line, you've got people going, yeah, of course it is. And on the other side of the line, you've got people, typical Germans, they should be more worried about immigration. And they sort of go, well, we live here, and we're more worried about climate change. Strange times we live in. Phil's in Crowell. Phil, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. It's your pet tanker driver here again.
Oh, yes. I should have introduced you to Mr. Vice President. Did I address him correctly? Is that how you're supposed to address former Vice Presidents of America? I should have checked with someone, really, before I dropped.
I don't know. I tend not to bump into them very often. James, since I've started working in the fuel industry as a tanker driver, I became acutely aware of the absolute volumes of... I don't think people really get the scale of it all, but if you imagine one loading terminal handling 500 tankers a day, which is not unusual, and then scale up the amount of loading terminals around the UK, and then the UK is a small island off the coast of Europe, and Europe is one of 5 continents, the sheer scale of road and aircraft fuels that is being burned is unimaginable. And you have to understand, I mean, it's a finite...
This is your livelihood. This is your livelihood you're criticising.
I am the turkey voting for Christmas, do you know? And I have a responsibility to the future, the same as everybody else does. And I think that the countries and the countries who are going to push ahead with the new technologies are future-proofing themselves, because I think that the geopolitical fallout in the future when oil dries up are going to be cataclysmic. And I think it's not just for climate change. I think for security reasons, I do believe that nations in the developed world and the developing world should really start to look at alternatives, not just because of climate, but because eventually there's going to be a big falling out, and terrible trouble because
but self-sufficient, sustainability, sustainability and self-sufficiency should not be controversial words, should they? It would be wonderful if I could run my house without having to pay anybody else. I could just stick some panels on the roof or have a windmill at the bottom of the garden, and then I wouldn't have to pay anybody else after the costs of putting in the panels in the windmill. And yet even that's controversial for reasons that are a bit odd.
Because you're not filling someone else's pocket.
Is it that simple from where you're sitting in the seat of your tanker?
No, I mean, I don't know.
No, in terms of the pocket-filling answer to the question, the reason why there's resistance to it is because lots and lots of people are making a lot of money out of the status quo, and the last thing they want you to do is to be self-sufficient.
We live in a society that is an oil-based economy. Everything is ground into there, and when you start making a hole in those people's profits. But it's not just climate that's going to change. It's going to be everything in the way we live our lives and the way business operates, because everything is based on oil.
You should see the film. You'd enjoy it. I don't want to keep you, Phil. You've got a delivery to make. Go and deliver that oil. You should see the film. It really made me think in lots of ways, and spotted some huge gaps in my own knowledge and understanding of major geopolitical issues. The drought in Syria, for example, played at least as big a role in the exodus of people from that area as the civil war that came a little later has done. The drought in Syria was sort of biblical in its scale and left people desperate and departing from territories their families had lived in for hundreds of years. The problem, I guess, is the incontrovertible proof. So you say to somebody like Al Gore, prove it then. Prove to me that power stations in the West are responsible for a drought in Syria. And you can't prove that sequentially. What you can prove, I think, and I'm not a scientist, I make that absolutely clear, what you can prove is that the simple injection of these gases, these exhausts, into the atmosphere make the atmosphere warmer and less pleasant to breathe. And I still sit here and wonder, it's not mystery hour yet, but I still sit here and wonder how anyone can miss that. I suppose it's a bit like back to Galileo again, aren't we? And the poor fellow with his telescope showing everybody that in fact the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Here are the pictures. Here's the incontrovertible proof. And then the Pope locked him up as a heretic for 50 years. It's 11:46. 10 minutes left on this. I think I finally got to the question that I want to ask you, and it's this. So we're talking about climate change. If you're just joining us, you've missed one of the most prestigious guests I've ever had on the programme, former Vice President Al Gore, whose new film, An Inconvenient sequel, is released this weekend. I do recommend it. It's not a perfect piece of cinema, but it's very powerful, very compelling, very informative. If you like knowing stuff and understanding stuff, it's strong. But what I don't understand is what he calls climate change denial. And most of the, if not all of the science, high 90s of scientific consensus agrees with him. But let's talk about people who don't. And this is the point that I should have got to earlier. This is the question. If I came along to you, so your biggest outgoings, once you've paid your rent or your mortgage, your biggest outgoings are your energy bills or your petrol bill, right? So I came along to you and said, I'm gonna really start campaigning for technologies to be introduced that mean your energy bills are going to be decimated in a few years' time. You're going to be able to power your home from a wind turbine in your garden or a solar panel on your roof, or of course you're going to be able to power your home from a solar farm, which you see now as you make your way up motorways in this country, or from a wind turbine. There's a lot in Norfolk. In fact, if you're ever in Swaffham, go to the one that you can go up. It's quite an old one. It's got a viewing gallery at the top, and it's absolutely fascinating. And if I said to you, look, we're going to really kill your energy bills. That's why we're doing all this, because at the moment everything has to be dug out of the ground in Texas or Saudi Arabia, shipped halfway around the world, burnt, refined, put in bottles, put in canisters, sent down pipelines. We're kind of going to save you a ton of money. That's the most interesting bit of the film. There's this mayor of a place called Georgetown in Texas, who I didn't know was an accountant. Mr. Gore or Al, you can call me Al. He didn't say on his way out of the studio. He's an accountant, and he's done it. He's gone pretty much 100% sustainable in the middle of oil country. He's a fully paid up conservative Republican Trump supporter. He's just done it for financial reasons. So why would anybody turn around and say, well, I'm terribly sorry, I want to carry on paying a fortune for my energy? That's possibly what intrigues me. Matt's in Merton. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First time caller here, so it'd be nice.
Always, Matthew, always.
I'm a geologist, so as my background, I've studied a lot about the Earth's processes and other things. And I want to say, first and foremost, I completely believe in climate change. I'm in no way a climate change denier.
Sure.
But I kind of want to play the devil's advocate with you and see what your opinion is. Obviously, the Earth's climate has fluctuated massively over geological time. We're talking millions of years. And we're currently just coming out of the past ice age. So the Earth naturally is due to be warming after the last ice age. Now, I know that human activity is speeding that up. But the point I would make is, let's say in 50,000 years, if we were starting to go into another ice age, and this is through natural processes, would we then try and warm the Earth for our own benefit?
Well, you might be asking the wrong fella, but the word I wrote down while you were talking was just control. I mean, as a human being, I can only really have an opinion over things that human beings can exercise some control over. You can't really exercise sufficient control to prevent an ice age, can you? If I've understood your question correctly.
Not exactly.
That's going to be some hairdryer, Matt. That's going to be the mother of all hairdryers blowing down from space. I don't. Possibly, I've misunderstood your question. Of course, there are fluctuations in climate. You'll know a lot more about that than I do as a geologist. But equally, the numbers are just irresistible now with regard to the accelerating warmth of this planet caused by what we do and what we burn.
Of course, they are. But there's also other elements to it. It's very easy to look at this from a one-dimensional point of view and think about the fossil fuels that we burn through petroleum, even coal-fired power stations. But the thing we have to think about is that fossil fuels don't only provide fuel, they provide a lot of other things as well, such as plastics. They're used in pharmaceuticals, in the petrochemical industry. So it's very one-dimensional to think of this purely as an emissions thing. Again,
don't you just start? I mean, don't you start with global warming and then you move on to shampoo bottles? No.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. In terms of the scale of importance and the threat to humanity, clearly global warming is one of the biggest threats. That's the thing that needs to be challenged first and foremost, and everything else can follow along the way.
Well, how would you answer that question I framed? You were already on hold, so don't feel that you have to. But this, I mean, it really, if you just sold it to people in the long term, and human beings are not very good at long-term stuff, but sort of politically even less so, and in the West considerably less so than in the East. China incredibly has its eye on 200 years hence as a sort of national interest. But if I say to you, even if you don't like being put on the same side of the fence as all these hippies and muesli munchers, look, this is designed, this whole campaign ultimately is going to make you able to heat your home or cool your home and light your house and drive your car for a fraction of what you currently pay, because we are looking at sustainability, the sun, the wind, the waves, whatever it may be, instead of digging stuff out of the ground and sticking a profit and a margin on it at every single stage in a 100-stage process. How does that not cut through more?
Of course, and for most people at present day, the bills that they pay, the price of the bills that they pay is one of the things that they can relate to the most. Again, being devil's advocate on the other side, the more gas you produce, let's say in the US, for example, I'm not an advocate for fracking necessarily, but the fact that they produce so much shale gas means that the gas price in America has tumbled.
And they've become less reliant on oil. But again, that would be a stopgap.
And their bills have gone down as a result of that. So there's, again, two sides to that coin.
You're right. And there's something we both missed that I thought you were about to say, which is green taxes. So you actually tell people that you're going to be worse off going down the environmental path because of green taxes, which popped up recently, didn't they, with some energy company boss claiming that the reason why he'd had to put up prices because of green taxes, but his own wages had gone up exponentially at the same time.
In the news last week, their prices are due to go up to something ridiculous, like 15%.
Yeah, and green tax, as I understand it, is designed to encourage you to stop doing the bad thing and start doing the new thing. So if you do the good thing, you don't have to pay the tax. You only have to pay the tax if you carry on doing the bad thing. But again, by the time it's been put through the mangle of a headline writer, it becomes a sort of assault by people we don't really understand, wonky-headed kind of, lab coat-wearing, bespectacled boffins politicians telling us that we have to pay money because they say so. And when you frame it like that, you can see how it gets traction. That whole, you know, establishment, whatever the nonsense is. I saw someone forwarded a tweet by Digby Jones. He sits in the House of Lords moaning about establishment elites, and I thought, I'm glad I'm not a satirist for about the millionth time since the Brexit referendum. I'm glad I'm not a satirist. How do you make satire out of a bloke in the House of Lords complaining about establishment elites? I do not know. Tim's in Rushlake Green. Tim, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. The other caller made some of the points I was going to make, but sort of coming not from the other side, I'm definitely not a skeptic, and I'm certainly not a denier. I'm probably not really a skeptic, James, but I've taken quite a lot of interest in this over quite a long period of time, and I've read quite a lot of books on it. And at the end of that process, I'm persuaded that there are two sides to this argument, and that the people on the other side of it are not mad. There are some very respected, eminent scientists who say that the whole climate change thing is just wrong.
Who? That sounded a bit aggressive. I need to research it myself, because all I ever get is bloggers and Nigel Lawson. So who are the scientists you...
I was about to mention Nigel Lawson as well. I have to say, first, I haven't read his book. I heard his interview this morning on BBC, as I heard Al Gore's as well.
What?
And you get the oft-repeated claim, correctly, Nigel Lawson is not a scientist. No, he's not. But he is a journalist. People forget that. He was a journalist before he was a politician, edited The Spectator. And as a journalist, he does what other journalists do, and he investigates issues. He reads up on it. He's a bright chap, and he is capable of coming to an opinion which should at least be respected.
But I'm looking for the scientists that agree with him.
Well, yes, there are scientists that do agree with him.
And again, I'm going to apologise because it's just a monosyllable, so it's going to sound like I'm rabbit punching you, but just give me a couple so I can just swat up on it myself.
What, other journalists?
No, scientists.
I can't name off the top of my head the other scientists. I mean, I've read a number of books. The other one who goes on and on about this and does come across as being slightly unhinged, I admit, is James Denningpole. But if you read his book on that...
No, but I did... Look, it's not a trick question, and I didn't... It's going to feel like one of my gotchas, this. Honestly, I promise you it wasn't. I just presumed when you rang in and said, I've read a lot, there are definitely two sides to this. There are scientists who agree with people like the ones you've just mentioned, and I say, can you tell me who I need to read? I'd like to find out more, and you can't name a single scientist.
That is a fair point. They're not household names. If we're talking
they're not household names in my household, but in your household, who's read a lot of books about it.
I cannot put my hands up. I cannot read that.
Well, let's not read anything into that isn't intended. It's an artificial environment that you find yourself on sometimes when you appear on the radio. Although I would have thought, if you were going to tell me that there's lots of scientists who disagree, like I asked Al Gore about the 3 to 5% or whatever it is of the consensus. I'm aware of the books that you mentioned. I'm familiar with... I've read Nigel Lawson's book. I haven't read much of James Claypole's work, but it clearly does all speak to the same sort of story, and that is why I asked if you could name the scientists. But I mean no malice by it, I promise. And that's it.